Welcome everybody. This is the Natural Resources and Environmental Law session. I'm Mike Linder and welcome to the session today. I think we've got really an excellent presentation coming up. Somebody who's in the eye of the storm of some major Clean Water Act litigation. So we'll get to that in a minute. I wanted to encourage you after the presentations, we're going to have a business meeting. So if you're interested in being active in the session, we definitely welcome you to stay and participate. So I didn't get the biographies from these guys from the bar, but I know a little bit about them. So Bill Stowe is the CEO and General Manager of Des Moines Water Works, and as you'll learn, he's been very instrumental in shepherding some challenges they've had with their drinking water system and water quality coming to that system. So look forward to that presentation. Then Anthony Schutz from UNL Law College is going to give kind of a Nebraska perspective, some thoughts on what the results of the litigation may mean for us in Nebraska. We've got a much different situation, a lot more reliance on groundwater for a drinking water source than Des Moines' situation, but I think it's dealing with one of the major exclusions of the Clean Water Act, and it'll help define, I think, how that exclusion is applied in the future. So really looking forward to it. Bill, I can go ahead and have you start.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's great to be at the Nebraska State Bar Association. I'm a member of the Iowa State Bar Association, and I almost want to blurt out Iowa, but it's great to be in Omaha and Nebraska. You know, the only relevant biographical point you need to know is I'm wearing red today. Probably not the red you want me to be wearing. I'm a University of Wisconsin-Madison graduate, so come on up to Madison, we'll give you a big hug. My pleasure to be here today to talk with you about really one concept with an important kind of policy overlay to it. The concept is protecting source waters. In an agricultural state like Nebraska and Iowa, that has certain consequences to it that really is kind of the focal point of our lawsuit. The policy piece of it is agricultural accountability. We'll be talking about our lawsuit and our attempt through both federal and state legislation to make producers, agricultural producers, responsible for their effluent, their discharge into the waters of the state of Iowa, the waters of the United States. But as you generally know, agriculture has been the beneficiary of a large exemption involving clean water. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. But let me give you a little background that's far more familiar to many of you than it would be to some other folks I talk with from time to time. I live in the state that, even in this dysfunctional, maybe especially in this dysfunctional presidential process, kind of leads the nation. Des Moines, where I live, I have the benefit of working, is a town a lot like Lincoln, a state capital about the same size. In the month of January, you cannot function in Des Moines without consciously thinking about it and not run into presidential candidates or TV crews. We are the first in the nation. And often that's kind of the backdrop the folks outside the Midwest see of Iowa, our state capital, and then that kind of iconic barn. You know, I'm a fifth generation Iowan, and I've never seen a barn look quite that good or quite that clean, but nonetheless, it's the kind of shots the media loves about our state. But we're really first in the nation in a more substantive way that has an environmental impact. And I'm going to talk, you know, I know we're lawyers. I have an engineering background also. I'm going to talk a little bit about science, the intersection of science and law, because I think it's important for all of us. You're in a very technical area of the law. In my view, like patent law, it is as much engineering and science as it is law. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that. But Iowa is first in the nation in corn, year after year after year. First in the nation in soybeans generally. Our neighbor on the other side of the state, Illinois, sometimes trumps it, wrong term, sometimes wins that contest. We're first in the nation in hogs. We have 21 million hogs and 3 million people. So, wow, if that ratio doesn't stagger the conscience, I'm not sure I know what would. And we're also first in egg production. The avian flu that hit us, and I believe hit you all a little bit in the eastern portion of Nebraska, and I know hit the folks in Minnesota a couple years ago, was a serious hardship for all of us. But there are consequences from being a leader in industrial agriculture in that way. This, unfortunately, is more the norm than I would want it to be of water quality. This is blue-green algae bloom, an HAB. Just to the north of the city of Des Moines in Polk County, in the county that I live and work in and draw water from. And it is a concern that you're going to hear more about, I'm confident, as Nebraskans. Our lawsuit and many years of our attempted collaboration with industrial ag really focused on nitrogen and nitrate concentration. This is largely over-nutrification, too much fertilizer and surface water that focuses on phosphorus, not nitrogen. We'll talk a little bit about those differences because I think it's pretty important for you to have a sense of how you mitigate against nitrogen pollution versus phosphorus pollution. Largely nitrogen in surface water. And let me back up and give you one more sciencey thing here. We are surface water providers. We're not groundwater users. In Nebraska, you actually have, particularly this area of Nebraska, as I understand it, not Omaha, but certainly between here and Lincoln, you have a number of folks who really take from shallow alluvial groundwater with all kinds of concerns, also about agrotoxins. We're a little different circumstance. We're taking it directly, like most large cities, including Omaha, from the Missouri River. We don't take it from the Missouri River, you all do, but we take it from the Des Moines and Raccoon River, but we're taking it directly from surface water. Sustainable, we've done it since the Civil War. And you all know if you go down to the Cargill area, go down to the Missouri River and look at that water is not fit for human consumption. You know that. There are a couple things that come to mind, I think, for most of us who have above average intelligence or above average science experience. It's full of suspended solids, right? It looks like cappuccino. It doesn't look like drinking water. It looks like cappuccino. Also, you know, it's full of all kinds of bad microorganisms, viruses, protozoa, bacteria. Traditional water treatment that's been around for almost 200 years does a really good job of dealing with both of those. When I am out complaining, educating, or involved in litigation, I'm not concerned about either of those two things. The bacterial pollutants or microorganism pollutants, to be more specific, or suspended solids, certainly it doesn't make my job easy, but we've done it for 175 years. And the science has done it very effectively in communities like yours and mine for 175 years. The third category that you can't see and don't pick up necessarily unless you have experience in clean water issues are nutrients in that surface water. I try to tell folks regularly when I talk with them that I'm not in the water business, I'm in the public health business. This is a commodity very much different than electricity or other things that you associate with a utility, cable services, natural gas. You cannot live without this commodity. The only thing more important in your immediate survival is oxygen, obviously, but water is a public health issue. It's not something to be taken lightly, and I'm sure you all understand that, but it really is the basis of our decision to move forward with litigation. As lawyers, I'm sure you will appreciate at least the context, if not the outcome. So, number one, we're in the public health business. Number two, we're surface water providers. A lot of reasons for that. When you draw from the aquifers, particularly deep aquifers, Ogallala in your case or Jordan in mine, you're getting fossil water. That's water that essentially won't be replenished. It is the water that's a remnant of glacial melt. So in this area, I don't know your hydrogeology well enough, but you'll hear in my area, the glaciers went through just 13,000 years or so ago, a blink of an eye in geological time. We don't want to mess with the aquifers. And realistically, you get into deep aquifers in my area of the United States, about 3,000 feet deep, to be able to draw water, and the water is very much iron-ridden and manganese-ridden, so minerals, we don't like those. In drinking water, we take it from the surface, it's replenishable. So public health, surface water quality is driven by land activities in the watershed. It's not driven by geology. I was in Arizona, I guess 2 weeks ago, and the surface water activities in Arizona obviously are far different than they are in Nebraska or in Iowa or Illinois or Ohio, wherever we may be. The surface water activities in my watersheds, as you'll learn more about here in a few minutes, is dominated by industrial agriculture, row crop farming, and animal feeding operations that are net generators of nitrogen that leaks into the surface waters of the United States and the surface waters of Iowa. Nitrate largely comes from either anhydrous ammonia or manures. Can come from human waste also, but realistically, my state, like yours, doesn't have a lot of wastewater discharge, doesn't have a lot of people. Again, 21 million people, or 21 million hogs, 3 million people. The human waste very heavily treated and regulated. The animal waste, not so much so. You get a sense of it. Great quote, like University of Nebraska, Iowa State is our land-grant school. Even our land-grant school understands that the nitrate contamination issue, the over-nutrification in our waters, phosphorus and nitrogen, are from row crop farming. Some would believe, or want others to believe, that we want to stop that process. No, we want to hold people accountable who produce in that system and have environmental impacts to those of us downstream. And we'll talk more about that in a minute. Water in the news, wow, I'll just flash through this quickly. A lot of discussion about water quality, water quantity issues. A couple years ago, Charleston, West Virginia had a chemical spill. They had to go off their river, tell people not to use drinking water. I'm confident folks in here have this sophistication, but in the event that one or two of you may not run across this experience to imprint your actions in the future, listen pretty carefully when the public water people talk about a water problem like do not use or a boil advisory. Sometimes boiling makes the problem worse rather than better, so be careful you listen to what's going on and what the advice is that's given you. Boiling generally obviously deals with microbiological issues. It kills things. If we're talking about a nutrient or a chemical, often it unfortunately concentrates it, makes it worse when you boil it off. So listen to what you're advised to do by regulators. I have the benefit, and it is a benefit, it's a great pleasure to sit on a group that's working on Lake Erie restoration. Lake Erie is the Great Lake that's basically from Cleveland and Buffalo on the east to Toledo on the west. A great natural resource, but one that's had huge problems with that blue-green algae that we talked about earlier on as a backdrop to a point I was trying to make. They lost their drinking water supply now a little less than 2 years ago because of this blue-green algae. It creates a microcystin toxin that is very difficult. It's unregulated now. We get advisories from our regulators on how to deal with it when we test it and find it, but it's unregulated. The science hasn't caught up. The science of treatment hasn't caught up to the science of detection. It is a big issue that you will hear about as Nebraskans, unfortunately, also. LA, I've got a lot of family in California. California's issues are basically water quantity, like they are in Texas, and like they are, I'm sure, in parts of Nebraska, as opposed to water quality. Our concerns are almost exclusively water quality related, not water quantity related. Every other year, each state, Nebraska, Iowa, is required by the EPA to designate stretches of surface waters, lakes, streams, rivers that are that violate a public health standard. They're not advisably fishable or swimmable. It's called an impaired waters list. The 2-year survey of that was last year for us, and the list of impaired waterways is over 700 in Iowa. And that's a record. Much of that is because of bacteria. Much of that is because of agrotoxins, but a huge wake-up call to us as Iowans, I believe, and as us us as Midwesterners, that we have a system without accountability in agricultural production that we have to get our hands around. Cringe at this one. Nitrates, I think, is something that I take for a heart condition. Nitrate singular is what our concern is in the water treatment business. The journalists don't understand that. We're talking about nitrate on the long rise, but we have a significant concern. The Des Moines Register is our regional paper, much like the Omaha Herald is for you, widely read by at least some constituencies, probably less widely read than it used to be, pretty influential in talking about public policy and science issues in our state. High nitrate is not just a concern for the 500,000 people that I serve. I serve, and I'll talk about governance for 15 seconds, I serve 500,000 people in basically 4 counties. Polk County, which is our equivalent, I think, to Douglas County, and 3 suburban counties. Dallas, quickly growing on the west side of Des Moines, and Madison and Warren, which are more rural but gentrifying pretty quickly to our south. About 500,000 customers. Some of it's wholesale, some of it's retail, more complicated than we need to for purposes of this, but we're a lot bigger than Des Moines. I work for 5 people who are trustees. Under Iowa law, there's a whole chapter on waterworks. They're appointed by the mayor of Des Moines and confirmed by the city council, even though most of my customers don't live in Des Moines. Most of them live in suburban areas around Des Moines. A governance concern that we haven't been able to shake yet, but that's another story for another presentation. All of you know Missouri and Mississippi meet in confluence. The product of that water movement through the Missouri and Mississippi into the Gulf of Mexico has created a significant environmental concern, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And unfortunately, that dead zone, LSU is kind of the custodian, scholars at LSU are the custodian of watching that. Some debate on whether it's bigger or smaller from year to year. I guess the real point is it's too big. It's the size of Connecticut and Rhode Island now, in an area essentially that is bereft of aquatic life. I'll talk a little bit about a lawsuit, because this is the headline that came out in several papers. This is actually an AP as opposed to the Register. But we have sued 3 upstream boards of supervisors in drainage districts, about a dozen drainage districts in 3 counties that we believe are point source polluters of nitrogen into the Raccoon River, our primary source of drinking water. And I just mentioned Flint because I have the privilege also of serving on the board of governors for the largest water utilities in the United States. Mine would be the smallest of the 100 or so biggest in the United States, but have a lot of interaction with folks in Detroit, folks from the Great Lakes, as well as the really large cities like New York and LA. When confidence in the public water system is shaken, as it has been in Flint, it has significant economic development impacts. You go back here to get your bottled water, or go home and drink your tap water without thinking about it. And we have relied on that to some degree in my business for a number of years. As we talk about rate increases and other concerns, I think we're moving away from that. But the point is, confidence in public water systems is an extraordinarily important part of our social fabric and our economic development. Flint obviously did not need an additional problem. They had problems long before drinking water concerns through lead poisoning. I am very hesitant to use the term crisis. When I can't find my car keys, when I lose my glasses, when I remember where I can't remember where I set my cell phone down, it's not a crisis, it's an inconvenience. But when we're dealing with drinking water, if we have serious, quantifiable, empirical data that indicates there's a concern about its safety, that is a crisis. And we point to a number of indicia that we have in central Iowa that has kind of driven us to this conclusion. Unfortunately, one that we keep setting records on beach advisories, much like your regulators in Nebraska. We have a number of public beaches in Iowa, and when some kind of hazard comes from testing of that, normally it's E. coli or a bacterial concern, there'll be an advisory put out, don't use the beach. The number of beaches that we've had, the number of advisories we've had in Iowa is a record in 2016. I mentioned the last time we surveyed the impaired waterways in 2015, it was also a record. And now we get into some of the nuts and bolts about nitrogen in water supplies. I mentioned you go down to the Missouri River, you grab a beaker of water or a liter of water and you look at it, you know suspended solids or soils are in there, you know intuitively there's a bunch of bacteria in there, but there are also a bunch of nutrients. The nutrients being fertilizers that are coming from the ag world generally. Some of it is native to soil, but not in the quantities we're talking about. The process to remove those nutrients requires a whole different process, a side stream process that's expensive, and in our case, aging quickly because of overuse to remove nitrate concentrations. We had to denitrify basically every other day, 50% of the time last year. The prior record was 109 days, as I recall, in the 90s. We built the world's largest nitrate removal facility now about 25 years ago. That's kind of like bragging that I'm the biggest chain smoker in the room. It may be factual, but it's not necessarily one I want to take a lot of credit for. But we had this mega facility that used ionization, valence electrons, if you can remember your high school chemistry, positive and negative. We used salt to draw nitrate out of already cleaned water as a next to final step before we deliver it. It's expensive, it's a technology we don't like, and it realistically is a technology that's being run into the ground because of the prevalence of nitrate concentrations in our surface water. We talked about the hypoxic zone. That's again kind of the national and international indicia or indicium of water quality, and a huge concern for us that I wouldn't have even talked about with any regularity or any emphasis as recently as a year ago is this blue-green algae issue. You saw a picture of it. We talked about Toledo. Assumption for people like me is that algae is a lake issue. It's not a river issue because quiescent water has a tendency to allow algae development far more quickly than moving water, right? I mean, that's kind of intuitive. Unfortunately, we're seeing levels of this blue-green algae and the microtoxin that comes from it at record levels in warm months in central Iowa. That's a big problem for us. We actually found a couple spikes in our water supplies on both rivers that's greater than what Toledo found on Lake Erie. So a huge concern for us, and one that's directly attributable to too much phosphorus and too much nitrogen in surface water. A little hydrogeology. I live at the bottom right corner of those polygons. Des Moines is at the confluence of the Raccoon and Des Moines rivers. The Raccoon is the one on the left. The Des Moines River, actually, its origin is just across the border to our north in beautiful Minnesota. Those two land masses, those two watersheds, are about 10,000 square miles. They're big. There are 10,000 square miles that are heavily farmed. There's not another major city within those, depending on how you want to define a major city in our Midwestern parlance. 80% plus of that land is under cultivation. So huge land use issues surrounding surrounding crops. That land was formed, that rich soil was formed by glaciation just 15,000 years or so ago. Glaciers came through Canada, came through Minnesota, down through north central Iowa, and stopped our capital in Des Moines, if you've ever been there. The gold building you saw, I think in slide 2, is at the terminal moraine of the Des Moines lobe, this geological formation that involved creating some of the richest soils in the United States, but soils that are incredibly moist and have a tendency to be bogs, to be swamps. To try and make that into agricultural land successfully in the 1880s and 1890s and early part of the 19th century, all that land was tiled. As many of you know, corn does not like wet feet. So planting corn in the bog in a prairie pothole just doesn't work. It has to be drained. And that drainage process now has led to flooding concerns for many of us downstream. Climate change is real. And even if it weren't, we still get some very unusual rains, let's put it that way. And it brings a quantity or a quality of water that's very different than if that water were naturally able to go through the biome called soil mantle and use those nutrients up in an effective way as opposed to mainlining them over into the waters of the state. Drainage tile. When I grew up, farm area, tile meant ceramic. It doesn't mean that anymore. You see what is very familiar to you too, corn huskers. Emerging corn in the lower left panel, coming up probably in May now. Knee-high by the 4th of July certainly is no longer an acceptable process. That's coming up probably in May, but about the distance, roughly the distance of the lectern to the ground here. Beneath that soil, it's tiled on 10 by 10 centers, some form of tiling. That's the modern equivalent, the one that I see going in regularly this time of the year in fields as replacement tile. But it's draining water from the root zone of corn and moving it laterally over into the waters of the state. So clearly it's artificially moving a quantity of water, but it's moving a heavily polluted, often with nitrogen and phosphorus, source of pollutants into the surface waters of the state. And now a little more hydrogeology. Iowa used to be the prairie state. In the 1850s, it was this beautiful prairie state. The green represents really our major waterways, and you see some forestation around that. That's today, 23 million acres of row crop. We have significantly altered the hydrology and the biology of our state. And in doing that, we are now learning about consequences that are unfortunate for those of us who are downstream. Talked about drainage districts. I'm going to come back to it for a second because it's critical to our lawsuit, and we'll talk a little bit about the lawsuit before Anthony gives perspective here in just a couple minutes. Drainage districts are, again, a government entity under state law that allows a partnership between private farmers. That black tile that you saw underneath a farm field is put in by a farmer. It's probably privately owned, but ultimately people who are on the same topographic level, neighbors, will join together to use common ditches, common drainage ways, channels, whatever it may be. And the boards of supervisors in each county where these drainage districts are recognized have then the power to tax for the maintenance and construction of those common conveyances. You can see by looking at this and remembering where our watersheds are that these were obviously constructed and exist in our state almost exclusively, with a few exceptions over here in western Iowa, to drain central and north central Iowa. Makes us factually a little bit different from a lot of folks who have a tendency to think, we're out trying to change the world with our litigation. Our litigation is very specifically focused on drainage districts. It gives you a sense of where the drainage districts and drainage tiling is in the United States. Not much here in Nebraska, very concentrated in north central Iowa, draining into Des Moines. A little bit around Champaign, Illinois, where I also had the benefit of living and watched your corn huskers take them apart a few weeks ago. And then you see the third one in the eastern portion of the United States, the eastern portion of the Midwest around Toledo, draining incidentally into Lake Huron and Lake Erie, going to the north and northeast. Counterintuitive for us who think water should drain to the south. It actually goes into the north. But a great inset there that shows ammonia, probably in the form of manure, being added, NH3, being added to a field, converting to nitrate, and then ultimately being mainlined from a tile into a channel. That's a huge concern for us from a water quantity and water quality standpoint, but a pretty good picture from the Champaign area about how that works at the field level. Nitrate is really the basis of our litigation. For a year, we tested a number of locations in the counties that we've sued to get levels associated with their discharge of nitrate, among other things, but nitrogen, our primary concern. Nitrate in drinking water is a public health concern, particularly for the very young. There's emerging science, peer-reviewed science now indicating it's bigger than just the very young and blue baby syndrome. But it's a regulatory requirement for us not to deliver drinking water to you, just like Your utilities in Omaha or Lincoln can't deliver it at more than 10 parts per million, 10 milligrams per liter. It's a public health requirement through the Safe Drinking Water Act and EPA regulation through the states. Again, emerging science that says there's probably more problems than just blue baby syndrome. But the real issue for you to remember is traditional water treatment doesn't get rid of nitrate. There has to be something else generally to be able to remove it. That's a headline from the Register about additional public health concerns. I'm a little hesitant always to put this graph up. The Raccoon River is our primary source of water. We built two multi-million-dollar plants on the Raccoon River. This shows a trend line about what goes on with nitrate concentrations. We've been testing the Raccoon River since the Depression, basically till now. I'm a little hesitant to put trends up there because many of you probably don't do a lot of math. In my business, we are far more concerned about peaks than we are averages. Averages say if my head's in the freezer and my feet are in the oven, on average, I'm comfortable. I ain't comfortable. And these numbers as averages probably don't give you much of a perspective other than that this is not some flukish thing that we've made up for our litigation. It's a trend that's pretty serious. For your information, when you see big dips, anybody want to give me a guess on what happens when it dips really low, like 2012 as an example? Looks like 1978 as I recall. What's going on there? Anybody have an idea why nitrogen in surface water by quantity would go down? Floods, absolutely. The solution to pollution is? Dilution. Well, not so much for our friends in the Gulf of Mexico who get a greater mass because of the higher flows at a diluted concentration. But as a water producer, I'm concerned about per gallon or per liter what the concentration is. I'm benefited by really rainy seasons because it dilutes it down. The Gulf effect is unfortunately worse because the mass, the number of gallons with a diluted quantity, is creating more of a problem in flood years than it is in dry years, for what it's worth. To talk about treatment, I'm not going to spend a lot of time, but it's obviously, maybe not so obvious, so I'll throw the numbers up there. It's a lot cheaper to remove nitrogen at the field level than it is at a water treatment plant. In 2015, when we operated 177 days to denitrify, it cost our ratepayers operation and maintenance costs of $1.5 million. We're running our system into the ground. It's just too old, and it wasn't intended to be run as frequently as we're having to run it to replace its $80 million. We view that as an externality of corn production. That is a cost that producers are pushing to our customers. Big issue for us, obviously, and pretty focal to our litigation. We filed suit against these counties. Sac County is the one to remember probably most specifically, about 120 linear miles upstream from our intakes in Des Moines. We picked that location for a number of reasons I could go into, and maybe in the Q&A we'll do that if it's helpful, not the least of which is they're out of our service territory. We're not suing Polk County or Dallas County, who are our customers and people that we have close connections with. But we view these folks as being point source polluters through the black tile and the series of drainage district improvements that you saw. Key points, the Clean Water Act has an exclusion, and I'm sure Anthony will talk about this, for agricultural stormwater discharge. Drainage tile is not agricultural stormwater discharge. It's agricultural groundwater discharge. The height and the installation of that tile is at the top of the water table. So as somebody who works with water designations on a regular basis, and per our experts in our litigation, there's no way that this is agricultural stormwater discharge. It's in fact groundwater. So we believe they're not exempt, basically, and you'd be really hard pressed to come up with the idea that they're not point sources. My training in engineering tells me a pipe is a point source. And we'll show you another picture here in just a second of a testing area that we did in Sac County that will certainly underscore, if that ain't a point, I don't know what is. How about that? Where's the natural hydrology there? That's a test point that we tested in Sac County. Clearly, you can't with a straight face say that that's not a point source. You may say that that's an exempt point source, trying to argue that that's in fact draining surface water. That would be a challenge and is key to our litigation, but you get the point. The lawsuit, we have federal claims in the Northern District of Iowa Sioux City Division that will be in front of Judge Leonard Strand in June of next year. Under the Clean Water Act, we're looking for permitting and PDS permitting for the drainage districts, not for individual farmers. Moving forward, we have a host of state claims that we've already argued in front of our state Supreme Court, but we haven't received an award back on or a decision back on. Judge Bennett, the federal judge at the time, certified 4 questions for the Iowa Supreme Court to answer. We're confident they will answer them. We're not necessarily confident that they will answer them the way we want, but it probably isn't terribly critical to our litigation. The state claims are primarily damages. We're looking for remedies moving forward. We've put up with years of nitrate problems and spent a whole lot of money to resolve it. We don't want to spend another $80 million in capital costs moving forward. That's the end game for us. Status, I've mentioned, done oral arguments in front of the Supreme Court, very interesting incidentally. And we have just an aside for us as lawyers, we have a judicial retention process. Pretty controversial in Iowa because we were one of the first leaders in recognizing gay marriage through our Supreme Court. Always a group that's trying to recall justices who come up for re-election or for reappointment, I should say. We have 3 that were part of that initial decision on gay rights that probably don't want to decide this question before their retention election is behind them, because they're going to make some serious enemies one way or another. So we're pretty confident that after November 8th, we'll be hearing one way or another on this, but the timing is probably strategically placed after November 8th. What are we after? I don't see this so much in Nebraska, but I do see it sometimes in Nebraska as I drive west. Our neighbors in Minnesota and in Wisconsin, a neighbor for us, not necessarily for you, just don't allow these goofy farm practices. That is horrible for water quality. That downcut erosion is throwing tons of soil and phosphorus into the Raccoon River. We're looking for minimum expectations. The industrial ag community should tell people these are the 10 best practices, 20 best practices, I don't care what they are. We're looking for clear responsibility on the part of folks who build conveyance, build pipes that go into the waters of the state or the United States for the effluent from that, and then ultimately accountability. There'll be a permit associated with that in our view. Just want to emphasize one more time, it's not just about nitrate. That happens to be what we're about and our lawsuit's about. Our tests focused on that for a year. But we're very concerned about the other problems associated with overnutrification. Blue-green algae being one of them. And again, one that we can find that there's a problem, but we can't find what the solution is very easily. The science has not caught up on the treatment side to that yet. Could talk about USDA, and maybe Anthony will talk about that a little bit, but we spent a whole lot of money to incent more production of corn as an example, monocrop. Don't tie it to conservation practices. When the money for conservation practices go away, so do the conservation practices. That's a big problem for us. What can be done, and I don't want to spend more than 30 seconds on this, when we talk about what can be done to make the water more suitable for us for drinking water purposes. There are infield and edge of field things that can happen. Infield, don't put nitrogen down in November. Hello, I don't care how cheap the co-op is selling it to you. Most of that's going to run off and create problems for us downstream. Or use of cover crops as an example, something that balances out the 6 months when there's no corn or soybeans there with 6 months where nitrogen needs to be used, and a cover crop can facilitate that. Those are infield things. There are a lot more, but on the edge of the field, bioreactors, filters. You give me a pipe, and I'll tell you, I can regulate how much volume comes out of that pipe at what pace, and also the quality of what comes out of that pipe through a media, through some kind of filtration process. Wood chips, as an example, is very good for removing nitrogen. So those are a couple things that you hear about on edge of fields, also constructed wetlands, buffers, other stuff. Nutrient reduction strategy, Nebraska has one of these also. Iowa's is strong in terms of science. The objective is to try and reduce what goes to the Gulf. The science is pretty good. It says 90% of the problem is from ag, 10% is from wastewater treatment plants and water treatment plants and tire factories or whatever it may be. We permit the 10%, the 90% we leave unpermitted. That's the public policy problem for us. Now we're hearing from our Secretary of Agriculture, both at the state and federal level, who's at the federal level, a former Democratic governor of Iowa. Oh, we need more time. We didn't get in this overnight, we can't get out of it. Well, I tell them, and literally tell them, just don't drink any water till it gets solved. That's fine. If you're thirsty, you need a solution a lot better than 2 decades out. Other states do a number of things, and Anthony may mention it. I'm going to stop there. Ooh, there's a stark picture of what drained land looks like in Iowa. First barren, so all kinds of phosphorus issues there, and a lot of water quantity and quality concerns about what's coming down through that ditch. Basically what we're asking is that ag, like any other business, should be accountable for its effluent. If I have a tire factory, if I have a municipal storm sewer system, and I'm discharging into the waters of the state, I got to have a permit. Ag should have the same thing. Enough. Turn over to you, Mike, to let Anthony say something or give a Nebraska perspective.
I'm not going to talk very long. We don't have a lot of time left, which is fine with me. I get to listen to myself talk every day. That's why I work at the law school. So I thought I was going to be the only long-haired guy with a red shirt on, but apparently I'm not, right? We just happen to be on the same panel, so that's great.
Hopefully on the same side.
I think so. I've seen about 3 presentations on this over the last few months. One was at the American Ag Law Association down in Oklahoma City, and it took the tone of basically a debate where the other side of the debate, I suppose the other side of Bill's story would be a bunch of folks talking about property rights and those sorts of stuff. I'm not going to go that direction because we're all lawyers, and I think that's a rabbit hole that really doesn't get you very far. The interesting questions, I think, with regard to the litigation, though, from a lawyer's perspective, are what they mean or what law they would make with regard to the Clean Water Act in particular. That is, to what extent in Nebraska and maybe in Iowa can surface water quality be a driver for nutrient management on the farm? That's a big leap, right? We haven't historically done that. We haven't felt the need to do that, or maybe we've felt the need to do it, but we haven't been willing to do it so far. And so I think that's probably the most interesting issue. Insofar as Nebraska is concerned, the Iowa litigation probably won't give us a lot of sort of direct precedent for the Clean Water Act being a big driver of nutrient policy, in part because we just don't have the same infrastructure. We don't have those drainage districts, right? In fact, the first time I ever heard of drainage tile was when we went to visit my great uncle's farm in Illinois. He's got about 10,000 acres in the Quad Cities area, a place where it makes sense to farm, right? We farm in the Republican Basin. Doesn't make any sense to farm out there. I didn't know that until I went to visit that farm. And the interesting thing about it was they had to drain water from the land in order to make it farmable. That's crazy to me, right? Coming from the western part of Nebraska, where we have to pull water from beneath the land to try to grow a crop. So the infrastructure is different, in part because the climate is so dramatically different. We don't have these nice intermediaries, I guess, that we could go after to try to drive nutrient management decisions that are made on the farm. In preparing for this, I tried to, though, maybe identify any other sorts of conveyors of pollutants that might perhaps be a suitable defendant in a clean water action along these same lines. I thought about maybe irrigation districts in the state, right? Like Central Public Power and Central Public Power and Irrigation District, or maybe our ditch companies or those sorts of folks that are bringing surface water to irrigate lands, and ultimately that water winds up in the Platte or the Republican or wherever and winds up in the Missouri, and there's nitrate problems associated with that as well, phosphorus problems. The problem with those is that they're all carrying return flow. They're all carrying surface water runoff, which is quite, I think, fairly clearly within the scope of a big exception for the Clean Water Act, which is for agricultural stormwater and return flows from irrigated agriculture. Those things are not point sources under the definition of the Clean Water Act. So I thought, man, it would sure be nice if that water held on for a little while, right? If it infiltrated the first few feet of soil and then went through a drainage district, then perhaps maybe we can make an argument, which kind of raised an interesting point to me, which was, does that kind of prove too much, right? In the Iowa case, is that really stormwater? Can it retain its status as stormwater even if it infiltrates 5, 6, 7 feet of soil before it's collected in a drainage tile and then discharged? Because in Nebraska, if it just ran off on the surface as it typically does, or it constituted a return flow from irrigation, well, that wouldn't be within the scope of the Clean Water Act. So maybe my effort sort of proved too much and shed at least one of the difficulties that they'll run into in the Iowa litigation is the line between stormwater and groundwater is a line that we've sort of made up, right? Along the same lines as the line that we've drawn in Nebraska between surface water and groundwater and in many other areas. That is, I'm not entirely sure what is stormwater. It could include water that infiltrates the ground and is drained, in which case we've got an exclusion under the Clean Water Act, which would pose some problems for the litigation. So long story short, the litigation and its focus on agricultural stormwater may give us some indication of what agricultural stormwater is, and that might help litigation down the road. If they're successful, they would be successful in basically arguing that it's no longer agricultural stormwater if it infiltrates the ground and then is conveyed into those drainage ditches. So a positive result in Iowa might not have a big impact on Nebraska. A negative result in Iowa from Bill's perspective might help shore up some of the concerns, I guess, that ag groups have in Nebraska. For EPA's part, they haven't done any favors in terms of trying to define stormwater. The Code of Federal Regulations definition of stormwater defines stormwater as stormwater. It says stormwater means stormwater runoff, snowmelt runoff, and surface runoff and drainage, which I take to mean surface runoff and surface drainage. So that's kind of the EPA definition. But whenever the EPA uses the term that they're defining to define the term, you know that there's not much behind it. So we'll see what happens with that stormwater notion. The other thing that I think is interesting about the litigation in Iowa is that drainage tile, this ditch that is behind here, we've had cases about whether or not these sorts of pieces of infrastructure can constitute point sources under the Clean Water Act. They are discrete, they are defined, but does what they do constitute the discharge of pollutants? And specifically, does it constitute the addition of pollutants? So there was a case down in Florida that dealt with a pumping station that was pumping water from one side of a levee to another. And then there was another case, I believe it was in California, where somebody tried to claim that a point source was a concrete conduit in a riverbed. And in the concrete conduit case, the court said, the U.S. Supreme Court, and this was Warren Company, said, no, that's not a point source. That's not within the scope of the Clean Water Act. But in the Florida case, the court said, well, if those two bodies of water are meaningfully distinct and you're pumping pollutants from one body of water to the other body of water, that constitutes the addition of pollutants. I'm not entirely sure what to do with these, right? That is, they're operating as conduits, but within a larger hydrologic system. Is it meaningfully distinct on one side as opposed to the other? In other words, the Raccoon River is one body of water. This is carrying water from fields. Are the fields meaningfully distinct from the Raccoon River? That is, does this conduit basically add pollutants to the Raccoon River? Or another way of thinking about it is, would those pollutants get there in time anyway, right? If that's the case, well then this thing really isn't causing any pollutant. It's not really adding any pollution. But on the other hand, it is speeding it up. It's maybe increasing concentrations at relevant times. And so I think it raises interesting questions with regard to what is a point source. And I don't know if they've necessarily put that in big dispute in this litigation. A lot of the fight has been about ag stormwater, I think, on the lawyer side of things. So fun stuff. That would have the potential to perhaps raise some significant precedent for Nebraska. That is, what constitutes a point source. When I look at the Iowa case, when I look at who's actually adding pollutants to waters of the U.S., I'm thinking of the anhydrous rig, right? And I think that constitutes a point source that would be subject to regulation under the Clean Water Act, and it's adding pollutants to waters of the U.S. And so one question I would have for Bill is, why sue the drainage districts? Why not sue the farmers? and go after them. But I think I know what the answer is to that one. Yeah. But in Nebraska, without the drainage districts, right, without those conduits, without those defendants, I think, our primary defendants would probably be farmers, planter boxes, anhydrous rigs, those sorts of things, dry fertilizer applicators, maybe CPS or whoever bought CPS would be a suitable defendant. But those are discrete conveyors of pollutants to waters of the U.S., and you could probably make that claim. The last thing I'll end with, one ought not forget the role of state law in all of this, and I was just trying to browse through the Nebraska statutes. Our definition of point source in Nebraska does not include any exemption for ag stormwater. It just says a discrete combined conveyance. So under Nebraska state law, we don't even have an ag stormwater question. We also don't have a waters of the United States sort of question in Nebraska because the waters of the state include groundwater, right? So you don't even have to go the surface water route. That said, I haven't seen a lot of people trying to push the council to adopt regulations that would extend NPDES type permitting to any other adders of pollutants to waters of the state. But maybe that would come down the road. In any event, those were just a few observations I had about the litigation. It'll be very interesting to see. I think the primary benefit of the lawsuit is, if it gets people to the table to start talking about who should bear the cost of agricultural production, especially these, then it's done its job. I don't know that you necessarily have to have success, but I think people are actually coming to the table in Iowa and saying, look, is this really something that Des Moines should bear as a cost, or is it something that the producers should bear as a cost? Unfortunately, we don't have a good answer to the question of who should. And it plagues, I teach a course in ag environmental law, it's all over the place, right? Should we pay farmers for environmental benefits, or should we regulate farmers to quit harming us? Well, the question of whether or not nitrates or nitrate is a harm or a benefit depends upon the allocation of rights at the outset. We don't have an answer to that question. We don't know if farmers are entitled to utilize at this particular level, or whether Des Moines is entitled to clean water. If we had an answer to that question, of course we'd know what to do. But some people look at it as, and I think the ag sector looks at it as, okay, that's fine. If you want to extract this benefit from us, pay us for it, right? Whereas the downstream urban folks look at it and say, stop harming us, and we ought not pay you to stop harming us. But we don't have that question of whether or not we don't have an answer to the question of whether it's a benefit or a harm. The politics of it are interesting. I think in Nebraska, if we would get surface water contamination at a level that got Lincoln and Omaha on board with trying to figure out how to deal with nutrient problems, that you would see a lot of regulation of agriculture, right? Because in our state, all of our population is downstream, right? And all that ag production is upstream. So it would be interesting if we had the same nitrate and phosphorus issues downstream in the lower Elkhorn or in the Platte. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess we don't. But in Iowa, I don't know. Are the population distributions such that the politics would drive it, or no?
Yeah, we're a state like yours. It's changing. We're more urban and suburban. There are only 90,000 farmers in Iowa, but the economic impact of industrial agriculture goes well beyond 90,000 folks, obviously. So unlike Nebraska, that is either so rural or so urban, we're in between. But there's been state polling on whether people agree or disagree, and no matter what area of the state you're from, urban, suburban, small town or farm, there is at least a plurality of agreement for what we've done. So the political issues in the Farm Bureau and others, as an example, are caught in our governor, caught in a pretty awkward situation politically. And just as Anthony mentioned, there's an attempt to try and negotiate out of it with sales tax dollars. The problem that I have with that is 90% of the sales tax dollars are paid by people in my service territory, plus Johnson County and Scott County, to some degree Potawatomi County. They're again subsidizing the producers. So that solution ultimately is a public policy issue. If I'm told by the people who I work for to take the money and run, I'll do that. But from a public policy standpoint, I also represent, like Omaha or Lincoln, urban areas where 75% of our public school students get subsidized lunches. Should their parents have to pay for money to go to Sac County for biofilters? I'm uncomfortable with that conclusion. But I'd be happy if I had less of a problem. The problem that we face is a problem you'll face, I'm confident, with a slightly different look. It probably won't be nitrate, but it'll be some other agrotoxin, whether it's a cyanobacterial issue or not, I guess time to tell. What questions would you all have? What would you talk about?
I don't know anything about Iowa law, but do your drainage districts have the ability to pass these costs? The parties who sued, they pass those costs along to the producer. And then kind of as a policy question, since producers really have little say over the price of the crops, how does that cost get passed along? And how do they manage that? Or are you really seeking to reduce production?
A lot of layers in that question. Let me start with the state law one first. Certainly a defense of the drainage districts here and the boards of supervisors who oversee them is the current state law does not allow them to levy for environmental improvements. They can levy to put a concrete channel in, they can levy for a culvert, they can levy to maintain all the above, but they can't levy to put a biofilter in. That's a portion of their defense. That's one of the questions in front of the state Supreme Court ultimately is, should an 1880 statute that talks about public safety and moving water continue to focus on quantity of water, or is there really a bigger issue in 2016 than whether corn has wet feet or not? So, you're right in focusing in on that. As to the externality issue, my word for there's a cost of production that producers aren't paying, our customers are paying when they pay a water bill that has to remove nitrate. That's the heart of the public policy issue. I will tell you I have a bias, and my bias is this. I worked for big steel and big energy, as in Mid-American Energy at some point, and a big oil company. When point source issues involving air quality came down, there wasn't a debate about who would pay for scrubbers. The shareholders and producers paid for it, not everyone. And I realize there are those who believe that agriculture, is this Grant Wood, American Gothic, kind of, yeoman farmer, they're at the mercy of the markets. I'm not sure that's necessarily the industrial agriculture that I know of, but nonetheless, there's a policy issue there about who should pay and how it should be paid. All fair. And there was a third prong to your question that I may have missed. I'm sorry.
Well, I think that's the main thing. So is your legislature interested in addressing the policy aspects of this, kind of readjusting the way your law works now?
Our legislature is running for cover because they read the polls. They know that this is the third rail of our politics, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican in Iowa. If the Farm Bureau is after you, that's a problem. Something the Farm Bureau is after, I can tell you that's a problem. I'm a little more insulated than if I were elected. But nonetheless, they're running for cover, and they frankly, there is a Democratic caucus that wants we don't have a unicameral, we have two houses. The Democrats run the Senate, the Republicans run the House, the governor is a Republican. Frankly, it doesn't make any difference, Republican or Democrat, in my view. The Farm Bureau has significant influence over all of them, including urban folks that represent me. But at the end of the day, the real issue is who pays? And how does that work? And that's a very difficult issue. I get that. But the default issue is my consumers pay, and we're tired of it because this is more than just an economic issue. It really is a public health issue. We came very close a few years ago because of demand and temperature and the amount of nitrate in our surface water from violating the law. Once that happens, that's a Flint issue. People use less of our product and they go get, whatever the hell it is, bottled water or whatever. Economic development in my area right now isn't driven by manufacturing, it's driven by IT. We have server farms, 4 server farms now, worth $1 billion plus. Those folks from Redmond, Washington, or California, they don't get us pissing and moaning about clean water issues. They demand it. They have billions of dollars invested, and they will look to whomever, Denver, maybe Omaha, when they hear our kind of intramural problems, and the legislature knows that too, so they're in a very difficult position.
Thank you.
Of course,
Much
later,
they'll get down
I should be more attentive, I apologize.
I think that issue, the identity of agriculture is an increasing policy issue at some point, I think, in the not too distant future, especially as all of this land changes hands over the next 10 years. All of that's going to be gobbled up by large operators. I mean, it's just the fact of life. No new farmers are coming in to the business, and they're not with $3 corn. So I think we're in this sort of storm where over the next decade, maybe decade and a half, agricultures continue to see more and more consolidation. And they're going to be energy producers and those sorts of things. And when we look at agriculture, perhaps in the next generation, we'll see it as an oil company. And we'll say, hey, right? We'll say, get your environmental impacts into line with what other industries have. Folks predicted that, though, 20 years ago, so I don't know. But I don't think we're making any inroads on getting agricultural production distributed back out to small farms, right? In fact, it's becoming more and more consolidated. And one upside of that is environmental regulation will be much more politically palatable. And because at some point, Farm Bureau will not be seen as an advocate for small family farms. It will simply be seen as an advocate for big oil. And if that's the case, then all of those voters in urban areas won't look at it as a, the guys who are owning the little red barn with the cabless tractor, because they'll realize that that's not what agriculture is anymore. Amy?
Yeah, one question for Bill and one for Anthony. So the point source, I'm still stuck on that. So the farmers own the tile and the pipe going into the river, right?
No, they would own, and it varies a little bit, but the general rule is this: the system, the infrastructure under the field, they would own. But you and I are neighbors. The topography take us as neighbors. The topography as neighbors take us to an outlet. Then the culverts and channels that would connect our private systems into the waters of the state are publicly owned. Is that helpful?
The ditch is owned by the drainage ditch.
Generally, that's the
Right,
case.
so what's the point source from the drainage ditch to the Raccoon River?
Well, our view is any pipe is a point source. So when it discharges from your private system into the public system, there is an impact from that. And generally what happens is ultimately those ditches that you saw will go through culverts and discharge or outfall, daylight. Yeah, yeah. There's no hierarchy in engineering. As lawyers, we've got a lot of hierarchy, a lot of predictability, not in engineering. It's whatever's going to move that pipe cheapest, and it's cobbled together over 150 years.
Right, so I was looking at the end of the pipe, but so it's into the drainage district.
Yeah, our position is at any point that the drainage district discharges into the waters of the state, they're a point source pollutant.
And then Anthony, does Nebraska have a commensurate constitutional handle? They use the Constitution for the state law. I can't think of any Nebraska constitutional handle that you could bring an action like this in Nebraska.
Yeah, it's kind of to give you a sense of what our theory is, because it's it's fairly arcane, as constitutional issues often are. We just say it's a deprivation issue. We have a right as a water utility with a permit from the state to withdraw from the Raccoon River to be able to do that in a reasonable form. And somebody who pollutes it upstream is essentially engaging in something like inverse condemnation. They're taking our
Because
property.
you're a private company, right?
No, we're a state public utility, and that's another issue we're currently out of the Supreme Court.
Okay,
We already have an
okay.
A right to be free from these sorts of costs. I mean, you can draw, in our state constitution, you can draw from a number of different provisions that deal with, life and liberty and those sorts of things. You could probably maybe draw it from the right to hunt and fish as well, because you need habitat, you need water, and you need those sorts of things, so you might be able to make the right to stay there. We may get a right to farm this next session. I think it's close to the voters will see on that. I don't know if that would help or not, but yeah, I don't know that we necessarily would need some sort of a constitutional claim to pursue
In Nebraska.
in Nebraska. Yeah. When I think of the constitutional issues in the Clean Water Act, I'm typically thinking of the scope of the commerce power and those sorts of things, but I don't see it.
One more question, maybe? Oh, there.
Is there any, this is to answer me probably not too, is there anything in our law dealing with natural resources districts that comes to bear and groundwater versus surface water there. That's an issue. But I'm curious in that connection too, with the ability to run public subdivision to sue the natural resources district. And how you do that, would you have to do the State Claims Act or something like that?
So a claim against a natural resources district in the state, I think it would probably fall within the Tort Claims Act. But I mean, more generally, natural resources districts do have the authority and often do exercise the authority to regulate the application of fertilizers and those sorts of things with an eye toward protecting the quality of groundwater. Because there, the costs are internal within the district and within the state. So we have...
I think there is some connection.
Yeah, we have a lot of incentives to regulate, and we do regulate. One of Iowa's problems is that generally the cost of agricultural production, I mean, they may be felt in Des Moines, but by and large they're felt by entities that exist way beyond their boundaries, right? And so you don't see much regulation until Des Moines steps up and says, hey, look, we've got all of these costs. But even they're only trying to recover a small portion of the costs associated with this agricultural production in the state, if we can deem it a cost as such, right, or a harm. But if it's a harm, what these agricultural producers are doing, they impose a little bit of harm in Des Moines, but they impose a heck of a lot of harm in conjunction with a whole bunch of other producers down in the Gulf of Mexico. So there, the incentives are off. They're not even seeking to fully internalize the costs of production. In Nebraska, with our groundwater, the costs of production are internalized at least to the extent the regulatory authority at the natural resources district level feels those costs or at least sees them. But I mean, it's somewhat ironic. I think nobody's anti-clean water, right? Everybody's for clean water. Nobody wants to see water polluted. It's just that we only have the will to do it in certain areas. Nebraska is fortunate, I think, with our NRD structure. We do have the will to even go so far as to regulate the timing of fertilizer applications. And, you know, in the York area and the Big Blue Basin, we do a lot of that. One problem we run into is we've got like 30 years of nitrate on its way, right, to those subterranean aquifers, and that's going to be an issue going forward. Hopefully I answered your question. I'm not sure that I did. It was close. There.
Okay, we should probably wrap up.